The insurance adjuster stared at the paperwork like it was written in a language he'd never seen before. "You're trading a what?" 2019 Case IH Magnum 340, Jake Morrison said. Calm, no hesitation. About $380,000 with the guidance package. Low hours, perfect condition. The adjuster set his pen down. "And you're trading it for—" "A 1974 International Harvester 1066. Silence, the kind that makes you aware of the clock ticking on the wall. "Sir, that doesn't— we're talking about a tractor that's 50 years old. 45, Jake corrected. "And yeah, that's what I'm doing." Before we go any further, I need to tell you something about what you're going to hear. This story is built on documented conversations, verified equipment transactions, and the kind of agricultural economics that shaped Middle America in ways most people still don't understand. The names have been changed. Jake Morrison isn't his real name, and the farm isn't near Council Bluffs like I'm about to tell you. But the numbers are real. The equipment specs are real. The reasons why a man would make a decision that looked completely insane to everyone around him. Those are real too. And if you've ever watched someone in your family make a choice that seemed backward, seemed like giving up, seemed like surrender, and then watched it turn out to be the smartest thing they could have done, I want to hear about it in the comments. This is that kind of story. Jake Morrison farmed 640 acres outside Council Bluffs, Iowa. Corn and soybeans mostly. Some cattle in the winter. His grandfather had bought the original 480 acres in 1947 for $187 per acre. Jake picked up the rest in 2012, right when land prices were hitting their peak. $8,400 per acre, financed at 4.2% over 20 years. The math looked good then. Corn at $6.89 a bushel, soybeans at $14.40. Yields climbing every year with better genetics, better equipment, better everything. The Case IH Magnum 340 was part of that vision. 340 horsepower, CVT transmission, GPS guidance, accurate to within 1 inch. Auto steer, section control, telematics that sent real-time diagnostics to his phone while he was still in the field. It was a machine that represented everything modern agriculture was supposed to be. Efficient, precise, connected. It also cost $7,200 a year just in insurance and property tax. Point another $4,800 in annual software subscription fees for the guidance system. If something went wrong with the SCR emission system, and things went wrong with SCR emission systems, you were looking at $18,000 to $25,000 for the DEF injector replacement and related components. Jake had owned it for 3 years. In those 3 years, he'd spent $31,400 on repairs that weren't covered by warranty. $31,400. On a tractor, he still owed $287,000 on. And then, in March of 2022, fertilizer prices did something nobody saw coming. Anhydrous ammonia went from $487 per ton to $1,492 per ton in 8 months. Diammonium phosphate, DAP, jumped from $563 to $1,089. Potash nearly tripled. For Jake's operation, that translated to an additional $52,000 in input costs for the 2022 crop year. Mock costs he'd already committed to when he'd signed the fertilizer contract back in November, locking in what he thought were high prices at the time. They weren't high enough. Corn prices stayed decent, $6.40 to $6.80 range, but not decent enough to absorb the fertilizer hit, plus the fuel increases, plus the elevated interest rates that were just starting to bite on his variable rate operating line. Jake's operating loan went from 3.8% to 6.2% between March and November of 2022. That added another $8,900 in annual interest costs. He did the math in his kitchen one night in January 2023. Corn silage stubble still standing in the fields outside, frozen solid under a moon bright enough to read by. If he kept running the same system, same equipment, same inputs, same acres, he needed corn at $7.20 and beans at $15.80 just to break even. Not to pay down principal, not to save anything, just to service debt and cover operating costs. Those prices weren't coming. He knew it. The futures market knew it. The bank knew it. Something had to change. Jake started looking at his cost structure the way you'd look at a house with a bad foundation. You can patch the cracks, sure. You can shore up the walls. But eventually, you're going to deal with what's underneath. What was underneath, for him, was equipment debt. The Magnum 340 was the biggest piece, but it wasn't the only one. He had a 2018 John Deere 1 775 NT planter, $187,000 financed. A 2020 Case Y H2150 sprayer, $298,000. A grain cart, a tillage package, trucks. Total equipment debt, $1.24 million. Annual equipment payments, $156,000. He started thinking about a conversation he'd had with his grandfather back in 2009, right before the old man died. They'd been sitting in the machine shed, and his grandfather had pointed to a tractor in the corner covered with a tarp. "That's a 1066, he'd said. Bought it new in 1974 for $18,400. Diesel, 6-cylinder turbocharged DT414 engine, 414 cubic inches. Put out about 126 horsepower at the PTO, maybe 105 at the drawbar. Had a torque amplifier, 16 forward speeds if you counted the TA splits. Could pull a 5-bottom plow all day long without breaking a sweat." He'd paused, looking at it the way you'd look at an old friend. Paid for it in 3 years. Ran it for 32. Spent maybe $22,000 on repairs total in all that time. You figure that out per hour, it's not even worth calculating. Thing just ran. Jake had been 24 then. He'd smiled politely and thought about the new John Deere 8330 he'd just ordered. 225 horsepower, AutoTrack ready. That was the future. This was 2009. The future looked different then. Now, in January 2023, sitting in his kitchen with a spreadsheet open and a balance sheet that looked like a medical diagnosis, Jake thought about that 1066 again. He went out to the machine shed, pulled the tarp off. The tractor was still there. Red paint faded to a dusty rose in places. The exhaust stack had surface rust. The factory cab, one of those custom cabs from 1974, boxy and loud but still intact, had cracked windows. But the tires held air. The engine wasn't seized. His grandfather had parked it in 2006 when he'd finally bought a newer tractor, and it had sat there ever since. Jake called a diesel mechanic he trusted, a guy named Vernon who'd worked on international harvesters for 40 years. "Can you get this thing running?" Vernon looked it over for maybe 10 minutes, checked the oil, pulled the dipstick on the hydraulic reservoir, turned the engine over by hand. "Yeah," he said. "New batteries, fresh fuel, change all the fluids, probably need to rebuild the injector pump. Cab glass needs replacing. Maybe $4,800 all in. She'll run." Jake did math he hadn't done in a long time. If he sold the Magnum 340, even at a loss, even in a soft market, he could pay down a huge chunk of equipment debt. If he got the 1066 running and used it for primary field work, his annual equipment costs would drop to almost nothing. No software subscriptions, no DEF fluid, no emission sensors, no telematics fees. But here's what people don't understand about going backward. You can't just swap tractors and keep everything else the same. The modern equipment Jake owned was designed for modern tractors. The reality hit him when he started looking at his planter. The John Deere 1775 NT was a 16-row vacuum planter with electric drives, variable rate capability, and isobus communication. It needed 35 to 40 gallons per minute of hydraulic flow just to operate the downforce system and vacuum fans. The 1066's hydraulic pump put out 12 gallons per minute, maybe 14 if you pushed it. You can't run a modern planter with 1970s hydraulics. Period. Jake spent 3 days on the phone and 2 days driving around Iowa looking at used equipment. What he needed wasn't just an old tractor. He needed an entire old system. He found a 1982 International 800 Cyclo air planter at an estate sale near Ames. 8-row mechanical seed meters. Minimal hydraulics, just needed enough flow to raise and lower the toolbar. The farmer's widow wanted $4,200 for it. Jake bought it, spent another $800 on new coulter blades and closing wheels. He sold the 1775NT to a dealer for $124,000. After paying off the loan, he had $11,000 left over. The downgrade from 16 rows to 8 rows meant planting would take twice as long. But the math still worked because the planter was paid for and the operating costs were nearly zero. Then he looked at his tillage equipment. The Magnum 340 had been pulling a 13-shank sunflower chisel plow with rolling baskets. Heavy, wide. Built for horsepower. Jake didn't have any more. He sold it for $8,700 and bought a 1970s-era IHC 4600 Vibra-shank chisel plow at an auction. 7 shanks, narrower, lighter. Built for tractors like the 1066, cost him $1,850. The sprayer was trickier. The 2020 Case Washia H2150 was a self-propelled unit worth close to $300,000. He couldn't replace that with old iron. There weren't many vintage self-propelled sprayers worth owning. He sold it for $287,000 and bought a used 2008 Hardy pull-type sprayer for $31,000. 40-foot boom, no fancy technology, no section control. But it worked, and his dad's old Ford 7740, sitting in the same shed as the 1066, could pull it just fine. By the time Jake finished re-engineering his entire operation, he'd sold or traded nearly every piece of modern equipment he owned. What he had left was a fleet that averaged 35 years old, and zero equipment debt. But Vernon got the 1066 running in early March. Jake paid him $5,100, a little more than estimated because the steering cylinder needed new seals and the clutch was marginal. He sold the Magnum 340 to a dealer in Missouri for $298,000. After paying off the loan and covering transaction costs, he walked away with $4,200 cash and no equipment payment. $4,200. That was it. That was what 3 years of ownership had given him. But the equipment debt was down by $283,000. His monthly cash flow improved by $4,800. And when he fired up the 1066 for the first time with fresh fluids and new batteries, the DT414 engine caught on the second turn and settled into an idle that sounded like a heartbeat. Steady, reliable, old. Jake spent the next 2 weeks learning the tractor all over again. The torque amplifier was different from what he was used to. You had to pre-select your range, then shift the TA lever on the fly to split gears without clutching. The hydraulics were slower. The 3-point hitch didn't have the same lift capacity as modern equipment. The cab was loud, no insulation, single-pane glass, heater that worked, but barely. He wore earplugs and brought a thermos of coffee, but it pulled. He hooked up the 7-shank chisel plow and took the 1066 into the North 40. The ground was still half frozen, tough going. The tractor dug in, lugged down to about 1,800 RPM, then pulled through. No error codes, no limp mode, no DEF regeneration cycle shutting him down midfield. It just worked. Spring 2023 was the test. Jake planted 640 acres with an 8-row planter and a tractor that was born the same year Richard Nixon resigned. He ran longer hours. He moved slower. He didn't have GPS guidance, so his rows weren't perfectly straight. There was overlap, there was waste, but he got it done. Planting took 11 days instead of 6. The fuel bill was lower. The 1066 burned about 6 gallons per hour under load compared to the Magnum's 12 to 14. But the total hours were higher, so the savings weren't as dramatic as he'd hoped. Maybe $2,100 saved over the season. The real savings came from everything else. No software fees, no DEF, no emission system repairs, no $847 oil change with synthetic fluid and proprietary filters. When something broke on the 1066, Vernon fixed it with parts from a catalog that hadn't changed since 1976. Fertilizer costs were still high, but Jake had adjusted his program. Less pre-plant nitrogen, more side dress based on tissue samples. It was old-school agronomy, the kind his grandfather had practiced before variable rate application became the standard. By harvest, Jake had spent $67,000 less on operating costs than he would have with the previous system. $67,000. The yield was down about 4%, partly from the simpler equipment, partly from less precise application. But the margin was up because the costs were lower. He made money. Not a lot, but he made money. And he didn't make an equipment payment. Now in 2026, Jake Morrison is still farming with the 1066. He's added a second older tractor, a 1979 International 1 486, bought from an estate sale for $14,500. And he's slowly replacing the last pieces of modern equipment with simpler, paid-for machines. His neighbors don't call him crazy anymore. Some of them call him smart. Some of them just don't talk about it. But 3 of them have started looking at their own equipment debt differently. One of them bought a 1970s era John Deere 4440 and sold his 2020 model. The numbers don't lie. When your cost structure is built on equipment that depreciates faster than land appreciates, when your operating line depends on commodity prices you can't control, when the margin between survival and bankruptcy is thinner than the paint on a new tractor. Sometimes going backwards is the only way forward. Jake still has the Magnum 340's owner's manual. It's in a drawer in his shop. 847 pages with sections on CAN bus diagnostics, Tier 4 final emissions compliance, and software update procedures. The owner's manual for the 1066 is 96 pages. Most of it is exploded diagrams showing you how to take things apart and put them back together. That's the difference. One machine was designed to be serviced by dealerships with proprietary software. The other was designed to be fixed by farmers. Jake's grandfather used to say that a good tractor was one you could repair with what you had in your shop. No computers, no codes, just steel, fuel, and knowledge. The 1066 isn't perfect. It's not fast. It's not comfortable. It doesn't collect data or optimize efficiency. But it's his. Completely. No payments, no software subscriptions, no leases. And in an industry where ownership is becoming rarer every year, where right-to-repair battles are being fought in courtrooms and legislatures, where farmers are locked out of their own equipment by encryption and licensing agreements. That matters. If you're in agriculture, if you've watched equipment costs spiral while commodity prices stayed flat, if you've made hard decisions about what you can afford versus what you think you need, I want to hear about it. And if you know someone who went back to older equipment and made it work, or if you think this whole approach is short-sighted and there's something I'm missing, tell me that too. Because this isn't just about tractors, it's about how we value things. It's about the difference between ownership and debt. It's about whether progress always means newer or whether sometimes it means simpler. Jake Morrison traded a $380,000 machine for one his grandfather bought for $18,400 50 years ago. His neighbors thought he was crazy. His balance sheet says he was right. I'd make sure you subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one. Stories about the choices that don't make sense until you look at the numbers, and the numbers that don't make sense until you factor in everything the spreadsheet can't measure. Under this video, you'll see a subscribe button, a small action with a big meaning. By pressing it, you're not only supporting the creation of more content like this, but you're also becoming part of the very exchange we've been talking about. Giving and receiving in harmony. It's not about the size of the action, it's about the meaning. A simple subscription tells me these words reached you. It tells me that the effort, the late nights, and the discipline to bring this message forward mattered to someone on the other side of the screen.